There we go. Over the last decade in America, a stunning rise in anti-LGBTQ sentiment has enabled vandalism, denigrating political and religious rhetoric, personal assaults, militia intimidation, murder, and mass shootings. Now, whereas LGBTQ plus business owners had been thinking a few years back that gay bars might no longer need to be a thing as a safe and social refuge, business owners today and entertainment districts are now rethinking that, whether or not 1970s-ish refuge is once again needed. Why? The United States have introduced 492 bills targeting the community's rights and often to dismiss and disparage those who are drag performers or transgender persons. Demonstrations and boycotts have targeted sports teams and companies that support an open and socializing LGBTQ plus community. Can you say Bud Light or Garth Brooks? And do I need to mention mass shootings? Pulse nightclub, Orlando, 49 killed, 50 wounded. Club Q, Colorado, 5 killed, 25 wounded. Nightlife has become a battlefield in this culture war. And that is our topic in this 24-hour Nation webinar. I thank you for joining us. Our panelists, Honey Mahogany, an activist, politician, drag performer, and singer. Most people outside the Bay Area will probably remember her as a contestant, I guess, in RuPaul's Drag Race. Those in San Francisco will know her as being instrumental in setting up the Transgender district. We're going to talk about Compton's cafeteria here in a bit. And she also served as the first director, and I'm correct, she, her. All right, we'll use pronouns today, so you're just going to have to cope. Those of you that are going pronouns. Dr. Erica Gonzaga is an assistant professor of American Studies at Cal State University, Fullerton, where his current research project is on the politics of pleasure and leisure in the modern United States. Eric is also a co-project director of Mapping the Gay Guides, and we're going to talk about that as we're talking about what it used to be like. Emma Kalin is a sexual health educator, consultant, writer, and activist. In addition to being the consent co-director at the fabulous House of Yes in Brooklyn, they develop trauma-informed policies, procedures, and training programs for nightlife communities and arts organizations across the East Coast. And we use they, them, correct? And Eric, he, him. All right. And Johnny Martinez is co-owner of 3 popular venues in Atlanta, Joystick Game Bar, and it's your what, anniversary today?
Today's our 11th anniversary. Yes,
11th
we're 11 years
anniversary
old.
of the business. Congratulations on being in business that long.
Right?
He also has By Weight and Measure, Mambo Zombie in Atlanta, and he likes to create spaces that encourage conversation and community. They are welcoming and inviting and inclusive spaces. He's also politically active, as you might imagine. He serves on the Atlanta Beltline Special Service District, and the Atlanta Beltline is a fantastic new opportunity in Atlanta for growth. So our outline today is to talk about what LGBTQ social life was, what happened again, and how we can all take steps to prevent our nights from being ripped apart by others' fears and prejudices, because everybody deserves to be safely out at night. Feel free to drop questions in the chat. One of us will either get to them as we go along, or I will triage some toward the end of this panel. Panelists, you are all welcome to speak at any time. I may move us along in the interest of time. And so the panelists know who is with us. I saw nighttime advocates, promoters, business owners, safe space program operators, Emma, including some police departments and universities, performing artists, tourism professionals, counseling services, and arts advocates signing up for this course. And people signed up from Eastern and Western Europe, Africa, plus North and South America. All right, let's begin. Any opening remarks any of you all would like to add at this time? Just to get us started, or shall we just dive in? All right, honey, are you running for any office right now? Or are you just raising hell in the Democratic Party?
I am not currently running for anything. I am looking at ways in which to be more involved statewide and nationally. I currently serve on, I'm chair of the San Francisco party. I'm, looking at ways in which to be more involved nationally because I know that, the needs here in San Francisco, we have a lot of needs, but they aren't the same as what's happening across the country and even across the state of California. So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
want to be able to use my experience both as someone who's been a legislative aide, who's helped write laws, someone who's a bar owner here in San Francisco, someone who has done a lot of cultural work and is a performer, to sort of use my platform to and experience to work on the things that we're going to discuss here
I
today.
should have pulled a track from your album and used it as a soundtrack for this
Oh,
particular. Okay, well, let's first talk about, and I'm going to rely a little bit. I think everybody has institutional knowledge about what it was like. I want to flip back to the 20th century, and for those of us, there are many people on this call who I would not assess to be of the LGBTQ community, so they may not be as knowledgeable. My husband says, "Oh, don't start with history. Don't start with history." But in the context of this, because what's happening is, I think people are wanting to. There are those in our culture that want to put the LGBTQ plus community back into its little hidden boxes. So what 20th century LGBTQ plus nightlife was like. Eric, you're doing a very interesting project right now with the gay guides. There were these products way back when, before you were born, called the Damron Gay Guides that were basically, here's where you can go socialize. Here's a
yeah.
book, you bought it, and tell us about that and your project and how the community connected and how they found places to go.
Sure, yeah, and I'll give you a brief even a little before that as well. Also, Randall, thank you so much for having us, and also what a really cool event because I'm a historian by heart, so I actually embrace history. Always start with history, but I found like people who talk about nightlife, they tend to do it from certain angles, historical angles, or marketing angle or business angle. So to gather people from very different angles to talk about this one topic is a really brilliant idea, and I really love it. It's very interdisciplinary, and I think that's a great way to do it. So yes, one of the things you should know about LGBTQ plus nightlife, if you know nothing about it, and hopefully some people know something about it, is that it didn't just like spring up out of anywhere. Like gay bars, lesbian bars, bars that are frequented by transgender people didn't just come out of nowhere, right? Um, in the early 20th century, they begin queer people, and we use that word queer because there's really no such thing as what does it mean to be a gay identity or a lesbian identity just yet. But queer people are frequenting places that they feel comfortable going to at the turn of the 20th century and into the early 20th century. And they tend to be places where they're considered kind of on the edges of the society, right? So there's not necessarily a gay bar in 1900, but there's a place where sex people who are in the sex trade are going to, or racial minorities are going to. This is where queer people are more likely to be comfortable. After the Volstead Act is repealed in the 1920s, also known as Prohibition, right? You start really seeing the first what we consider gay bars. And I'm going to use that word kind of in historical context, right? Gay bars really come up in the 1940s. There were definitely gay bars in like New York City and major cities in the 1920s. But by the 1940s, you start seeing gay bars really popping up all over the country. I really mean that in Buffalo, in Worcester, Massachusetts, Indianapolis, Los Angeles, Denver, right? Cities start having this institution that even though many people don't know about it, queer people start realizing that we can have our own culture in these spaces. And by the 1960s, even before some momentous events that some people are probably familiar with, Stonewall, the Compton cafeteria riots, where queer people are going to now be part of the national conversation, political conversation. Queer people are realizing that they can be themselves openly now, beginning in the 1950s and the 1960s. But first of all, how do you know where to go? How do you know where to gather? Right, nightlife is actually one of the main institutions. I'm going to argue the main institution for queer people in the 20th century. But how do you know where to find these places, right? If you're lucky to live in a city that has newspapers, you could perhaps find a gay newspaper, and you can look into that gay newspaper and find a listing of gay bars. But one of the ways I have tried to identify queer spaces is using early forms of gay travel guides that start being published in the 1960s. And they're not geared toward all queer people. I want to point that out. These gay travel guides are really, I mean, there's many different forms of them. I study the Damron guides, but these gay travel guides are really kind of promoted to gay men specifically, and let's be honest, white gay men. But these are kind of the first national guides that even though they say nothing about being gay on the outside, you kind of have to know what these guides are because you don't want to get caught with it, right? But they're the first kind of national listing of almost every state and every major city in that state that just lists places, mostly gay bars, that are safe for, at that time, gay people. And this is the kind of the only real, I mean, even though they're not holistic, right? Because what does it mean to be gay? It's not, they're not going to show us a lot of black gay spaces in the 1960s and 1970s, but it's kind of the first thing we have that we can actually start quantifying the number of gay spaces. And in the early 1960s, I mean, just my team has been going through these guides and trying to count numbers, getting rid of bars that are still safe spaces for gay people, but are not actually gay institutions, hotel bars or whatever. We think there's about 500 gay spaces in the mid 1960s, gay bar specific spaces. By the 1980s, by the early 1980s, that's going to go 3 times that. So about 1,500 gay bars, specifically gay bar spaces. And that's during the 1970s, the surge of gay spaces. So this project is really trying to start mapping, trying to understand gay spaces, and just trying to show how queer people are everywhere in the United States. They're not just in San Francisco, they're not just in New York City, right? They're in my home state of Indiana, but they're also in Montana, they're in Michigan, right? They're all over. And sometimes nightlife looks very different in these different kinds of spaces. And that's what's really exciting about it. So I'm excited to hear other people's perspectives on that.
Well, and I love hearing a historian talk.
Thank you.
But the other thing too, it is in this space that when oppression began to happen, the pushback began to happen. So it not only was a place of socialization and networking and a place to go out and meet people and be public, to be out. It became the place that when oppression began to happen, that's where the clientele began to push back. And this is really kind of where the gay movement began, within nightlife. Before, I'm new to the awakening of the Compton's cafeteria story. I didn't even know about it. I knew about Stonewall. I was old enough to remember Stonewall, watch it on TV, but I had not heard about Compton's cafeteria, which happened a couple of years before. Tell us about that scenario and how that wound up shaping what is now the transgender district in San Francisco.
Sure. I mean, I think, some West Coast, East Coast rivalry. New York always gets all the credit, but no, but in all seriousness, I think the reason that Stonewall is better known is because there was, in 1969, there was that huge protest, and then immediately afterwards, that's when we started celebrating gay pride. So, but prior to Stonewall, there were several uprisings across the country, including Cooper's Donuts riots in LA, and but we referred to the Compton's cafeteria riots as the first officially documented collective uprising of LGBTQ people in the country, because it was written up or referenced in newspapers, and there was historical sort of documentation of the fact that it occurred. And so we really wanted to raise awareness of this thing that happened here in San Francisco, in the Tenderloin. And for those of you who have been watching, a lot of the stuff that has been said about San Francisco in the news, a lot of it is focused on the Tenderloin. It is a neighborhood that has such deep and really, really incredible history, but has been used by the city as sort of a containment zone. Historically for generations.
Oh, interesting.
And for communities who are oppressed, communities who are maybe not necessarily deemed acceptable by the general public at the time, that was where they were relegated. And I'm talking about immigrants, definitely queer folks, low income folks, and that's also where a lot of the illicit behaviors and activity would happen. In fact, the reason that they called the Tenderloin is because I love talking about the LGBTQ history of San Francisco, but the reason it's called the Tenderloin is because, at that time during, whether it be prohibition or, various illegal activities would be happening, like speakeasies and gambling, all of that was allowed to happen in the Tenderloin as a containment zone. And at that time, police would allow that to happen, but they would get payouts from these businesses. And that's why it was called the Tenderloin, because it was the juiciest part of the meat of the cow, right? There's the tenderloin, and the Tenderloin in San Francisco, this small area, was where the police could make the most money through extortion. And this relates to the Compton's cafeteria riots, because the Compton's cafeteria was right in the heart of the Tenderloin. It was a 24/7 diner. It was the place, pre-cell phones, pre-even everyone having a landline, a place where people would go and connect and could reliably find people and make sure people were okay, but also, dish gossip and talk about, trade or whatever they were talking about. And they were more or less felt safe in that space. It was basically their living room for the queer community. And, as would happen, police would come in regularly and, demand payouts and maybe rough around some of the patrons in order to sort of emphasize the fact that they needed to be paid and keep people on edge a bit. And one day this happened with a drag queen, and she had had enough and decided in 1966 to throw her coffee in his face, and that started a days-long riot in the streets of the Tenderloin. Out of this sort of time was, we had a lot of institutions come out of that, including Glide, which is a huge nonprofit, and also church here in San Francisco. I believe Hospitality House, which also is an organization that helps to serve the unhoused here in San Francisco. All of these things sort of came out of that neighborhood, that movement as a result of that riot. So really an incredible part of our history here in San Francisco, and I think contributed to the other uprisings that happened across the country, including Stonewall.
Well, I want to restate the fact that the genesis of a lot of pushback and the growth of the queer community and the pushback against the oppression came out of the nightlife scene. And this is how important this cultural connection was. Do you have any additional insights you want to add to what it was like, Johnny or Emma? No.
Well, I mean, I will say that when I was before I was old enough to go into bars and before I was out, that's what I would do. I mean, I would sneak into in Atlanta, it was Backstreet. That was open for decades and decades. It was a 24-hour club. It's where everybody went. It was the island of misfit toys. And so there was a place for me to explore my sexuality in a way that didn't require me to be completely fully out, but also could still be myself. And if you can't do that at home and you can't do that at work, then you don't really have a lot of places where you can do that and you feel comfortable. And Backstreet, I think, helped a lot of people here in Atlanta. And as someone who's 100,000 years old, that I remember that, and that was I don't know that I would have come out as early if it hadn't been for these bars and clubs.
Sure, right. It's
and
about.
Okay. Can I also say, I just want to point out one of the reasons why nightlife spaces are so important, and the reason why they were so transgressive in the middle of the 20th century was, I think it's important. I think we all just kind of know it. We have to say it, is that even homosexuality is criminalized in every single state. Sodomy laws exist in every single state until the 1960s, and even then, even after the 60s, many states, not till in 2003 in Lawrence versus Texas, do all sodomy laws go away. But talk about nightlife spaces specifically, it's illegal to serve homosexuals alcohol in most bars, including in liberal places like California and New York, into the 1960s and the 1970s. Into the 1970s, there's same-sex dancing bans, so you're not allowed to dance with a same-sex partner, right? But also to piggyback Honey's awesome comments about Compton, like the reason why this place, the police are going in and raiding the bar is that there's a cross-dressing law in San Francisco at this time, right? You're not allowed to wear clothing that does not match the gender of your ID, which sounds very topical today, right? That law is not repealed until the early 1970s. So nightlife spaces are incredibly transgressive. What they're trying to do is incredibly important in this time period. Ironically as well, they are also, I mean, we think of them as kind of safe spaces for queer people, but they're often not safe spaces. And into the 1980s and 70s and 80s and 90s, they're often inhospitable places for queer people. They're often racist places. They're often homophobic, anti-women places, right? Anti-trans places. And so we'll talk about that later on. But I just want to point out, but like everyone, even though they're safe places, people are trying to find them, they are extremely dangerous places for queer people as well.
I also want to piggyback on that. I'm so glad that you brought that up. I wanted to also just underline that they were actually called public decency laws. So it wasn't like it was done in a way that was actually pretty broad. I mean, and this could apply to people who were both, disfigured or, had disabilities, or people who are unsightly, and that also applied to people who would cross-dress. It's also important to remember that this was happening at the same time where in places like Germany, pre-World War II, pre the Nazi sort of takeover of the government, that there were anti cross-dressing laws on the books, but they actually were creating space for trans people at that time. So like in Germany, you as a trans, well, specifically woman, I'm not sure about trans men at that time, but just trans women could actually get a license basically, or a certification that said that they were transgender and they would be allowed to dress as the gender that they identified with in public. And also that immediately following that was when the Nazis sort of took power. And then something that isn't talked about enough is when you think about the Nazi book burnings that happened, one of the first places where they did burn those books was at the clinic of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, who was a gay Jewish doctor who ran a gender clinic in Germany. So for those of you who have seen the movie The Danish Girl, when she goes to that clinic, that was the clinic of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. And the very first book burning, the largest book burning, the one that you see most of the pictures of when you look up Nazi book burnings, that was the book burnings of the clinic of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. And the reason that they did that was they said that this research into gender and sexuality was sexually explicit and inappropriate material. Again, to that sort of sense of public decency, protecting the decency of the public, protecting the children. Like these are things that have been used in the past, which also is why they're attacking us, not just in the nightlife, but also educational institutions and the way in which we teach history, so that they can continue to use these old, tired, but effective methods of obfuscating, distracting, and gaining power.
That resonance of pre-Nazi Germany is a little bit what inspired this particular panel, because it kind of feels like that's what's going on. I want to return just a little bit in terms of a historical perspective and nightlife. The gay culture, the queer culture also became the basis for what is now club culture around the world. If you can trace back to disco, the whole EDM world, electronic dance music world, techno, trance, rave, house, all of it kind of, it's like a religious denomination that split up into several different churches, and each of these churches kind of thrived in Detroit and Chicago and New York and Berlin. But out of the gay culture, out of the queer culture also came a culture for many people that still lives. And I think that was important, and the importance of being a part of that and being out became open. So in the 2000s, a U.S. president for the first time uses the word transgender in a positive context in a State of the Union address. Don't ask, don't tell gets wiped off the books. Same-sex, the Supreme Court of the United States did something I never imagined I would see in my lifetime. They approved the language, my language is not correct, but same-sex marriage became legal. Suddenly you saw, as Johnny has talked about with me, the kind of a decline of gay clubs, because there was this sense that, oh, we're in the money, we can assimilate now, we can be out there. We don't need lesbian clubs, we don't need gay bars anymore. So there was this sense of a mainstreaming of a culture because of these kind of high-level decisions that were made. And then 2016 happens. The tide turns again. The political climate changes. One has to say, I have to say, my opinion, that in part because pushback from suddenly a population that seems like it has been in control is suddenly threatened. And it was bad enough to have a Black president. Oh my God, we almost had a woman president. And so all of this is an uprising against that trend. And suddenly we're seeing the pulse shooting, the club Q, the transgender murders, the rise of the alt-right, the vilification of drag performers and transgender individuals, which continues today. The statistics on the increase of violence and violent behavior against the LGBTQ plus community is staggering. I read one report from ACLED that said anti-LGBT demonstrations have more than doubled this year relative to 2021, and acts of political violence targeting the LGBT community have more than tripled compared to 2021. We also have seen, I believe the number is 490 something different state bills introduced that have been designed to targeting the LGBT community, but also in specifically drag performers and transgender. So something's going on, and this can't help but be intimidating to part of our community. And so what do we do? And how's it affecting nightlife? And what now? We thought we weren't going to need gay bars in our own places anymore. How do we respond? What can we do? What is going on now? And to this, I'm going to turn to you, Emma. When I contacted the House of Yes, Kay Burke said, you have to talk to Emma. Emma knows all about this. So tell us how today we can respond and keep the night safe and secure for everyone.
I mean, that's a big question. What I can say is that my dissertation research was on sexual safety and nightlife for people who are both gender and sexuality minorities, so people who are both queer and trans. And no one, to my knowledge, has really talked to people who are openly trans about what they need to feel sexually safe in nightlife in a, in a research context. And most of the people who talk to queer people talk to queer young adults, and young adults are awesome. I love young adults and parties. And also, like, none of us are young adults, and like people party after they're 25. And so I thought it was really important to think about like what it means to think about like an actual full club of people, all ages, who are legally allowed to be in a space. And with the recognition that, like, as Eric was saying, nightlife is very important for queer people historically and currently, so it actually matters how we create space. And almost all the research has been done on assumed cisgender men predating on assumed cisgender women in this like heterosexual context. So I mean, we don't know very much because like I did one study. But what we do know is that some of the stuff that, assumes cisgender women who are getting harassed by assumed cisgender men, like the things that they don't like are also things that trans people don't like. But there's also this like beautiful thing about like minority cultures, like especially like sex and gender minority cultures. And then you add in like all the other stuff, you add in racial and ethnic minorities, you add in disability, neurodivergence, age, and what you get is what I found, which I think like maybe we'll see if it resonates with people, but what I think, like when I found this, I was like, wow, yes, this is the thing, is it's not just that we want the absence of violence. Like we all want that. We all want like to be in a club. We don't want anyone to, we don't want people to shank us. We don't want people to hurt us. We don't want people to say mean things to us and use slurs. We want people to like ask before they touch our bodies. Like this is all like pretty standard for like everyone. But like when you talk to queer and trans people, like what do you actually really, really want to feel sexually safe in nightlife spaces? They want to be fully themselves, and they want the people around them to be fully themselves too. So this feeling of like, I can be who I am, I can wear whatever I want, I can move my body in whatever way I want to, I can express myself in whatever way that I want. And it's not just that I'm the one freak doing that and like it's fine, but that I'm seeing other people around me who are doing that too. And that's like a protective community safety as well. And I think that's just like, I'm gonna swear, it's fucking beautiful, like it's so.
Swearing is okay. This is my gig. We can do whatever we
I love
want.
it. It's so affirming to be like, yes, this is what we want. We want spaces that aren't just spaces where we're allowed to be, where we're permitted to be, but like spaces that are ours. Like other people can be there too, that's fine, or not, separatist spaces are useful too, but spaces where we don't have to like regret that we wore that really slutty outfit or that really like gender expansive outfit, or regret that we kissed our partner or partners or whatever.
So tell me a little bit. I did not get to go to House of Yes when I was in New York with a bunch of colleagues, but a bunch of colleagues went, and they said that even to enter a House of Yes, there were some things that any customer needed to adopt or embrace, or some principles. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so some clubs, not just House of Yes, but a couple other clubs in New York, some in San Francisco, Bay Area, some around the world are basically adopting best practices from play and kink spaces, which are basically ways to acculturate people, get everyone on the same page. Like, these are behavioral guidelines. Every nightlife space has implicit behavioral guidelines. Like, if you hit me with a bottle, you're probably out. But then there are these other implicit guidelines that, you know, some people might know and some people might not know. The one that I always think about is like, how many steps, if you want to dance with someone, how many steps should it take to dance with someone? Culture tells us generally like one step, you just dance with them. But actually, like, maybe you use some body language to show that you want to dance, see if the other person wants to do that. Maybe you ask them verbally if they want to dance with you. Maybe you have more of the like, anyone can put a hand anywhere once, kind of like cis gay orientation, where you try, and if someone steps away, then you don't try again. And so at House of Yes, like, if you buy a ticket, you have to click some buttons that say, I understand some of these things about consent culture, and I understand that we have a zero tolerance policy. I could get kicked out and I won't get reimbursed if I don't follow that. And then when you come in, generally we have people at the door reiterating those policies, and other clubs like nowadays in New York City does that as well. Some places, including our space, sometimes has like, in addition to traditional security, has community security, or kind of like the equivalent of dungeon guardians in kink spaces, that are just people who are like partying with their eyes open, partying with a purpose. They're mostly sober. They're here to help. If you need help, you can ask someone who maybe looks more like you and doesn't look like they could deck you, which is, you know, like what we want with security most of the time. So there's a lot of different models, and like, what I'll say is the research is so preliminary. Like, no one is like, this is the best practice. We've done all of this research and we know that everyone should do these things. Like, I would say the best thing to do if you are a nightlife operator listening is like, I can share my research and be like, this is what I found, and these are the things that I know, but try these things, see if they work for your venue, try other things, talk to other people, talk to people in your community, ask them what they need to feel safe. But like, take safety seriously, because like, I think about it like with a return on investment, where, you know, so many people will say, you know, I don't go to that club anymore because I got harassed there, I got groped there, you know, worse things. You know, someone said a racial slur to me there, I don't want to go back. Like, you're losing that customer. Why? Like, just fix the problem, like, make it better, create a space that feels good for everyone, the lowest common denominator, the people who need the most support. Then it's going to be nicer for everyone, and then you'll make more money.
I have to tell you, nighttime business operators like making money, don't they, Johnny? So recently I walked and honey, also with the stud, you want the stud to be profitable. Recently I was in Vancouver, and I walked up and down Davie Street, which is kind of the main drag there for the queer community, and I saw on various windows of businesses, safe space, safe space, safe space, these little rainbow decals. I gather that various programs in various cities have, police departments perhaps in partnership with the community, have some kind of, this is like they have in many cities, where you can, if you give birth to a baby and you don't want to have the baby, you go take it to the fire station. Is this kind of like that? Is it like this is a safe space for you to come to? Tell me, who can talk to me about those safe space programs? Okay, Emma or Honey, also, whichever.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say, like, just quickly, that like, safe spaces, like, you can't promise safety. Like, there's no way, like, that's not like, we can get like safer spaces, but like, if you promise safety, like, it's just not going to work, because something that makes one person feel safe might make someone else feel threatened. And there's just like no way to promise that. And so anyone who's saying like, if you implement this program, like, buy my program and everyone will be safe, like, don't believe them.
It's a safer space, honey.
You know, and I would say that we shouldn't assume that all queer spaces are safe spaces, because a lot of times they are not. And sometimes that comes directly from ownership. Sometimes that comes from the culture that's developed in that staff. Sometimes it comes from the community that they're in. And we have to be better about recognizing our allies who can actually make things work for us. As you know, as someone who's in their 50s, you know, I have had to learn, and I've been happy to learn from trans employees what they needed, because I didn't know that instinctually. And so I think we have to make sure that we don't make the mistake of thinking that just because someone is in the queer community, that they know what everyone else in the queer community needs. And so we have to continue to educate everyone, including people within our community, because that's who needs to know it the most. And so I feel like I've learned more in the last 10 years than I learned in my 100 years before that.
100 years, honey.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I want a little bit more clarity on what we're talking about, but because, you know, I imagine that some cities maybe do have a safe space program where it is more like a part of like a business association or something like that. But I also feel like there are many places that are just like, we want to be a safe space. And especially if you're in a place where maybe LGBTQ people are under attack, they're like, hey, LGBTQ people, you are welcome here. And that's their way of signaling that LGBTQ people are welcome, but doesn't really guarantee any sort of safety, right? That being said, you know, my experience with the Stud, so the Stud was a part of one of those bars, I think, that was, you know, amidst all the LGBTQ bar closures, we were sort of on the tail end of that movement. We were, you know, being forced into closure because our building was bought out and blah, 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 blah. But a group of us got together, 17 of us, and formed a collective. And then we bought the business, we bought the liquor license, and then we, you know, found resources and a business plan that, you know, allowed us to be able to pay the rent that had been basically tripled. We were very intentional about creating a space where everyone was welcome, or felt welcome. We had a relatively diverse 17 membership. We really wanted to make sure that gender equity was a part of that, both in our programming and in our staffing. And then we also felt it was very, very important to list out some specific rules for people to follow. So I love this idea that Club Yes is like, has like, you have to like sign in or check some boxes to acknowledge that you've read it, because for us it's just like, it's posted at the front door, it's posted behind the bar, it's posted in the bathrooms. Like, we have posted it at many places, but like there's no like, people like aren't like actually confirming that they agree to that. But we do have listed like, you know, this is, you know, you cannot be, you know, say anything, there's no racism here, sexism, fat phobia, you know, slut shaming, any of that. Like, and people, there are very explicit guidelines for people's behavior and what constitutes like assault, and what you know, and what will not be tolerated, and that people will be kicked out if they violate those norms. And here in San Francisco, I think following the Stud sort of establishing those guidelines, we saw more of that, like more clubs starting to adopt that. And then also there was a large sort of like nightlife consortium event that happened, where a group of promoters and drag queens sort of got together and sort of like had an accountability conversation with a lot of the bars who, well, all the bars, and some of the bars, you know, I think were held accountable for bad behavior in the past. So it is, I think, really important for us to have a conversation around this collectively as a community, because these spaces are not just businesses. They are supposed to be for our community and safe spaces and places where we can feel safe and welcome, especially given what's happening in the country right now. And let's be real, in a lot of the country and even the state of California, a lot of it has never been safe, right? And so these queer bars and are supposed to be the place where we can find community and again feel safe.
Well,
So go ahead, Eric.
I was just wondering, and this is actually a question I have in my mind. I'm thinking from a historical perspective here, and I'm fascinated to hear what all of y'all think about this. But I love what Emma was talking about, like best practices and trying to build like a welcoming space, as Honey was saying, in some of these new nightlife spaces. But I wonder, like, as Emma mentioned, or I think maybe Johnny mentioned as well, like in the end, nightlife establishments are mostly commercial establishments, right? They're meant to make money. And as much as we want them to be welcoming places, right, and safe spaces and all these, like in the end, there's a kind of a tension there between making a welcoming and accepting place, but also being able to bring in consumers into your place as well, right? I mean, that's the only way to survive, is to make money, right? In some ways. I mean, do you all see any of this tension within like your work and and running a business? Like, I'm wondering, like, because historically, like even though people would say we're all for the LGBTQ community, like in the end, and this is how racism worked in the 80s and 90s into the 2000s, right? Like we didn't want our bar to have too many Black people because then it would take white people away, right? We can't have too many women in this bar or else it's not going to be known as a gay bar. So as much as we want this to be a queer accepting spaces, I'm wondering how much is there that tension still between people who, business owners or even the community itself, who as much as they want to be part of a broader LGBTQ community, really are wanting spaces that are much more exclusionary, even though they're not going to say it. I'm curious, I'm making that up. Is that a thing of the past, or is that still something that's going on today?
I mean, I can only speak for myself, but having heard Emma and Honey and you, Eric, say this before, I think there's a natural extension for a safe space for the queer community to become a safe space for other communities. When it comes to immigrant communities and people who are in a place where they need a space where they can go, I think often they just find our spaces, right? So when it comes to the money thing, you're right. You're like, if we don't make any money, I go out of business and I can't do anything. But I don't think you have to compromise who you are or your belief systems or your morals to make that happen. If anything, I think when you're more specific about what you are okay with, it draws those people in. I think it's better to be super white hot about what you believe in as opposed to lukewarm. And then, I think it comes back to you, hopefully. And if it doesn't, then maybe that wasn't the best. Maybe you shouldn't have been there to begin with. I mean, sometimes businesses just go out of business because they suck. You could be an incredibly safe space, but if your music is shit and your cocktails suck, then people aren't going to go there. You have to be more than just a safe space commercially, but morally, that should, I think, still trump money. That's why I'm the poorest bar owner in Atlanta. So.
I think that's a very smart question. And also, like, I think that there is a little bit of a, I don't think it's an either or. Number one, I was, Johnny, I'm glad you said that, because I would say that, like, as a collective, making money has always been important in terms of keeping the doors open, but this is not a primary source of income for most of us. And so it is a labor of love. As is honestly most bar owners, some of it is a labor of love. But in addition, I would say that, like, for us, our target audience, right, is a diverse one. And we want people coming to our bar who are going to be supportive of the idea of acceptance and inclusion and safety and diversity, and not people who are, gonna be offended or anti-Black or, any of those things, or not want women there. Like, all of these things are very problematic for us in both our bylaws as a collective, our guiding principles as a collective, and also in our business plan. We want to, because ultimately those communities that we're talking about, whether it be the Black community, women, the trans community. I mean, I can speak to the Black community specifically. Like, the Black community spends money, so like if you cater to those communities who have been traditionally excluded, like that actually is a strong business plan. And I'm not saying that, like, it's like in a city or a county where there's maybe like 2% Black people, like, yeah, maybe you're not gonna, have huge parties that are, all, predominantly African American. But, like, is that a place where you're tolerating racism? No, right? I mean, you can say that that's not allowed, and that should not offend or prevent white people from accessing your space. And if it does, then that's a problem.
Well, and
Yeah.
let me shift the conversation here just a little bit. So we're talking a lot about the queer community and queer business settings for customers. What can folks do who aren't necessarily a part of the LGBTQ community? What can they do to help ensure these safer spaces, to help change the thinking, to help become allies as this kind of rise, this fearful kind of rise in the political climate in the United States continues to build up, and this pressure continues, and the militia continues to show up at drag queen story hours at libraries? Please, what can non-LGBTQ plus people do?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Emma.
I mean, one answer to that is just, like, we need better, like, bystander intervention. A lot of people, almost everyone that I know who's queer has bystanded for someone else who's also queer and does not feel supported by people who are allies. And I think a lot of that is just like, you need practice. You need to practice stepping up. You need to practice when you hear that person yelling racist stuff on the subway. You need to like step in, you know, like this is why like at the George Floyd protest, like there's best practice of like the first row is like white bodies. Like, how are you using your privilege to provide support to other people? Like, that's really, really important. And that's something that when you're a minority, you kind of have to do it because you have to protect your community. You have to protect yourself. But what if you didn't have to, but you saw something happening at a bar? Like, could you practice as an ally stepping in and saying something? Could you use your privilege as like a big white man to, you know, like step in and be like, hey, let me divert you for a second? And there's a lot of different ways that there's a lot of different trainings for being a bystander. And you can just practice. You can practice with your friends. The longer you practice, the more easily you'll be able to do it in the moment. So that's something that you can really do. You can also, like, I think about this in terms of like the person with the STI is always the one in the relationship who like has to disclose, and like that's horrible. And like, what would it be like if in an adjacent way, it wasn't just minority people calling for these types of you know, like safer spaces statements that like Mahogany is describing that she has at her bar? You know, like, what if you were friends with a bar owner and you said, you know, like, I just went to this really cool bar and they had this thing on the wall and in the bathrooms that said that everything, you know, we have to protect each other and we have to look out for each other. Like, could you do that instead of like the minority people always having to like wrangle and do it?
Interesting, and the word I hear a lot is active bystander training. We actually have a couple of podcast episodes on the 24-Hour Nation website from people who provide that service. But wouldn't active bystander training be a wonderful thing for churches to do? A way to redirect some of their passion and support. I mean, I just as soon go to a Sunday school class that taught me how to be an active bystander for somebody else. What a wonderful thing that would be. How Christian that would be too, or Jewish or Muslim or whatever. Who else wants to talk about what businesses can do? By the way, Ian Fox, who's on the call, and he's in the UK, he says in the UK they call them civilized spaces as opposed to safe spaces.
But this is America, so you know
that wouldn't work because we don't know much about civilization. So who else has a suggestion of what other people can do?
You know, I'm just going to piggyback on what Emma said, because you have to speak up. You have to be present, and you have to be present in the moment that someone needs you, and not down the road, not like, oh my gosh, I wish I'd said this. You have to be brave then too, because sometimes you're putting yourself in a position where you're going to experience a whole ton of hate that maybe you don't expect and never experience in your life normally. And you have to do that for your people. You know, you have to do that for your friends and your family. And I think a second part of that, and this is super old school and maybe more difficult, is that when people around you come out in whatever way they come out, you have to let them do that, and you have to give them that space, because nothing converts people more to love, I think, than knowing that the people they love are experiencing something. It opens their eyes, it opens their hearts, and I think that I don't know that we push that enough yet, because we used to, and I think that helps out a lot. But you have to be vocal. You have to be vocal. I have a very distinct memory of my father when I was younger, because growing up in the South, I would hear all sorts of shit in elementary school, and the first time I heard the N-word, I didn't know what it meant, and I was in second grade. I went home. I used the N-word at home, and my dad immediately said, "We don't use that word in this house. That's a word for small people, and we're not small people, okay? Because they use other words for you. Don't use that word." And then he explained to me what it meant. But if my dad hadn't said that, I mean, who was going to educate me about that? So we just have to stand up and be, grown-ass adults about it, and protect the people that we care about.
And we need more big people than small
and
people.
Also, like,
culture, Eric.
Yeah, and also just, I'm sorry, I use that word historically all the time, but that's all I know. So, like, it is nightlife owners, queer nightlife owners, who are the major people who finance the rise of the queer rights movement beginning since the 50s, right? There was the bar owners, the Tavern Guild in San Francisco, who was funding all of these campaigns that eventually brought what you talked about, Randall, about, you know, the rise of same-sex marriage and all this kind of stuff. But I think this is such a kind of a cop-out answer, but I'm going to say it anyways. I think it's really important. How many of us know our city representative, right, or our local city councilors, right, and all of these major laws that are really, really targeting queer Americans recently, drag bans and you know, all this kind of stuff, right? They're happening not at the national level. The United States Senate isn't passing these laws. The president is not passing this law, right? It is local ordinances. It is state politics. It is city politics. That has always been the most important things. And that, I mean, even though the courts have been the easiest way for the queer communities has historically have gotten their quote unquote rights, right? It is local politics where they have really succeeded, right? It was when they figured out that they could be, because they're living together in the Tenderloin or in San Francisco, or they're living together in the gay neighborhoods of Kansas City, whatever, they're living next to each other. They're now a political constituency, right? People have to listen to them. And that is where real change is made. And so I know that's such an easy answer, education. We should all be educated. I know that's such an easy answer, but it's true. We have to be much more involved in local politics, even though it's boring. It's often municipal. It's about, you know, water prices and where's the where's the new road going to go? And I know it's boring, but that is where change happens at this really local level. And sadly, all these local institutions that used to help guardrail against an uninformed public, like local newspapers, are evaporating because of our collective societal ignorance of these kind of important local matters.
It's a very interesting point. We don't have that kind of institutional journalism that's kind of keeping us bound together. Honey, as somebody who has gone into politics, and albeit in San Francisco is like Oz. It is like the place you want to go to if you're LGBTQ, I think. But so for the folks who are in Cheyenne, Wyoming, or the folks who are in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, how could you convey your role in terms of becoming politically involved as being helpful to this protecting this sociability of the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to first say, like, I agree with everything Eric said. I think that certainly that was the case for me. I realized how important local politics was. I'll try and be brief, but, you know, I was working as a social worker. I'm an MSW, and I saw, in addition to seeing all the displacement of the gay bars and the shutting down of all of our safe spaces, I know we're using that word a lot, I saw a lot of the pushing out of our community members from San Francisco as it got more and more expensive. And so that's when I got really engaged in local advocacy, you know, because I realized, again, as a social worker, we were failing so many people on the streets. How do we change that? Well, let me get my master's and create programs. Then I realized that, oh, I can't create the programs that I want because the funding streams are, you know, government funding streams, and they require, you know, X, Y, and Z to be done in a certain way. And so we have to advocate with the government to change that. And so that's what got me into advocacy. And then I quickly ended up getting into sort of leadership within the Democratic Party, and then also working as legislative aide and chief of staff to our board of supervisors, because here in San Francisco, we have a city council and a board of supervisors in one. That was very, very real. You know, as a legislative aide, I was able to work on legislation that, you know, made nightlife protected in San Francisco, helped to increase access to or change zoning so that, you know, nightlife spaces could open up. Also helping to write the legislation that created cultural districts here in San Francisco, not just the trans district. We now have the Castro LGBTQ cultural district, the leather and LGBTQ cultural district in the south of Market, where Folsom Street Fair happens, and we have all our leather bars, including the Stud, and, you know, and so much more. So I was also going to say that in terms of really changing this national narrative, and I say national, but even here in California, it's very real that localities have a lot of power. And even here in California, places like Temecula and some places in the Central Valley, like, conservatives know what they're doing. They've been working on this a long time. They're working from the ground up. They're taking over our school boards. Like, even here in California, again, there's conversations about outing trans children to their parents before they're ready, banning, you know, LGBTQ literature and books, and, you know, teaching about accurate histories. Like, these are conversations that are happening even here in California. Recalls, all of these things are things that they are doing here, even in California. So while California is a sanctuary city for a state for LGBTQ people, San Francisco is a sanctuary city for LGBTQ people. And certainly, I would say here in San Francisco, I don't think that many people, you would experience very much discrimination as an LGBTQ person. There are so many other challenges that we are facing, and getting involved in local politics is one way in which we solve some of those challenges as LGBTQ businesses, as queer people, as people who may be poor or moderately incomed living in an extremely expensive city like San Francisco. It's also really important that, and as chair of the Democratic Party here, we've really used our privilege as San Franciscans to do advocacy work across the state and across the country. So calling in when there's an important judges race, because again, those judges are our first line of defense when anti-LGBTQ laws do get passed. Calling in when there are, important ballot measures up for a vote, including like what just happened in Ohio when they tried to prevent access to abortions from being, made legal across the state. So we, part of being an ally also is using your privilege, as someone else had said, to do things, whether that means your time in phone banking and knocking on doors and letting people know, whether that means your money and donating to organizations like the ACLU and CLR, so many other organizations that are doing these legal battles, and also in your everyday life. Not like, and not just even confronting people out in public, which might be scary to folks, but talking to your families, because even I know that I have Trump voting Republicans in my family, and I do not, I don't care. I love them because they're my family members, but like, they're going to hear from me that they're crazy and ridiculous, and here's why. And so we need our allies to not get tired, not say like, oh, but I want to preserve this relationship with a loved one. Well, your loved one is literally leading to people dying. So if you're not having those conversations with that person, which by the way, like, you're not saying like, you're not, harming that person, you're trying to help them, then you're not being an ally. I mean, this is what people were losing their lives marching for civil rights in the 1960s. And I'm not saying that people should put their bodies on the line, but what I am saying is that we need to rethink about, like, we need to really question like how our own comfort levels and our willingness to move past our own comfort zones.
That's perfect. That's lovely. I've got one last question here I'm going to bring forward. It actually comes from a bar owner I know, or a club owner in the UK. He said, how much did the lockdown and the drop in nightclub and late night venue attendance been a part of this kind of anti-LGBT movement? Has the fact that everybody was shut down and they were looking for somebody to blame, I mean, did that play any role? Did the pandemic play any role, do you think, in this rise, or is it just coincidental?
I'm going to say I don't think the pandemic played any role. I think the Republican Party had a Newt Gingrich in the 1980s very specifically said, if you want to win elections, find a wedge issue. And that's what they do. They've been doing that forever. Illegal immigration, women's rights, trans rights, the gay community, gay marriage. This is it's not even something that maybe they even all believe in. This is a power move for them. This is what they do so they can get the people who vote for them to show up on that day. And so I mean, there might have been some additional a push from the fact that they use the pandemic closing as a political tool, right? But they view everything politically, and it's all a question of staying in power. And I'm so glad that you mentioned running for office, honey, because that is, we should all consider ourselves candidate recruitment committees of one. And if we can't find someone to run for that office, then we should do it, because that is how we make change. But I don't think the pandemic made it worse. I think Trump made it worse. And I think that that the standard operating procedure for the right wing in this country is to demonize people so they can because their base is more motivated by hate and fear. And so they demonize groups depending upon what election cycle is so they can win. And they're very good at it. They're very effective at it, which is, again, why it's so important for people to stand up, run for office, and be open, especially as an ally or yourself.
Well, and go ahead, Emma.
I would also say, I'll just share like from my experience in the bubble of New York City and specifically Brooklyn. I feel like everyone came out of the pandemic realizing they'd spent a lot of time thinking about themselves, and a lot of people came out as queer and a lot of people came out as trans. So I actually feel like, at least in my community, there are more of us. So there could be a backlash from that, of more families having to deal with the fact that now there are openly queer and trans people in their houses and in their communities. But I wouldn't say that like the community has gotten smaller, more insular. There's like way more power now than there was.
And also, I mean, the fact that this question came from the UK is really interesting because it's something that I see that was a rise happening. Well, one of the tactics that I think came from the lockdown was that, like, in so much that Johnny mentioned the wedge issue, right? Like, the wedge issue used to be, oh, we hate gay people, right, or lesbian or something like that, right? But what happens, I think, a more interesting and more insidious tactic that's much more used now is to try to not target LGBT people, right? But to cut off one of those letters, right? To say, oh, we're fine with the LGs and Bs, but the Ts are really, you don't want to join them, right? And that is a really insidious tactic that has come out in the last couple of years. And so these tactics are not the same old kind of ways it used to be. It's really a kind of a new innovative approach to really kind of target queer people in general. And it's pretty scary.
Divide and conquer. I think it's
they literally have classes for this. If you're a young Republican or a college Republican, it's called the Morton Blackwell Leadership Institute, and they teach you how to divide groups up so that you can win. It's literally just a part of their process.
Yeah. And can I just
say, as a former Republican,
I was just gonna say, well, I don't know. You finish that. I have a comment.
I am 52 and I was 21 then, and so yeah, we all make mistakes.
Oh my gosh!
But as a left-wing Democratic Socialist now, who is happily partnered, I hope I've done my mea culpas for it.
Yes. I was just going to say, as someone who is in the room with some of those people, that they do not believe the things that they are doing. They know that it's nonsense, but it is a political tool. And I think that makes it actually more evil. Like, I think that if you are willing to do anything regardless, whether it's going to lead to people dying, children dying, just to gain political power. I mean, I think that is kind of the definition of evil. If you actually believed that you were saving people's souls or whatever, like, at least then I can say, okay, well, it's still problematic and horrible, but I can understand your intentions and that in your belief. But a lot of these politicians who are passing and introducing these laws do not believe in them.
Okay, so with that, nighttime advocates of the world, don't be evil. Everybody deserves to have a safe night out and to socialize with those people we want to socialize with in a vibrant and exciting and safe space with people we love. I love these people right here, right now, just from having met them all for the first time. I want to thank Honey, I want to thank Eric, Dr. Gonzalez. I never called you doctor. You should. You worked for that. I want to thank Emma. I want to thank Johnny. I also want to thank a couple of people here. Jocelyn Kane with the Responsible Hospitality Institute, who introduced me to Honey and got me connected there. Kay Burke at the House of Yes, who introduced me and got me connected with Emma Kaywin. Michael Paul, who's the nighttime economy manager for the city of Atlanta. This is a new position that's rising up in several cities. We need to get on all those people's agendas. And he introduced me to Johnny Martinez, an Atlanta businessman. And Eric came to me via bizarre algorithms and what used to be called Twitter. So when a gay historian popped up in my thread, I thought, this is the fourth voice we need on this panel, and it was. I thank you so much for this. Thank you for dialing in and listening. Our next 24-Hour Nation webinar will be on September 20th. It's going to focus on the city of Detroit and what's happening with that nightlife scene and the electronic music that we talked about, and the connection between Detroit and Berlin in bringing the club scene to life. 24-Hour Nation likes to focus on thought leaders and issues and opportunities in the nighttime economy in cities around the world. We also offer things to do that are interesting and intriguing in various cities across the United States. Finally, let me thank my husband in the other room for giving me the idea to do this panel. It was a smart thing. We don't hear this talked about. You can visit our website at 24hournation.com or follow 24-Hour Nation on social media. Thank you very much. My name is Randall.
Great to meet you all. Thank you.
Yeah, same. Thank y'all so much for this.